October 1944. A crisp autumn wind sweeps across the vast golden plains of rural Minnesota. Inside a modest farmhouse, the air is warm, smelling of fresh coffee and baking bread. A young German soldier, barely 20 years old, sits awkwardly in a wooden chair. His name is Klaus, and his hands, calloused and scarred from the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, rest nervously on his knees. He is a prisoner of war, an enemy of the nation, a man trained to believe that Americans were godless monsters. Across the room, an American farm wife, a woman whose own neighbors have sons fighting and dying overseas, calmly approaches him. In her arms, she carries her infant son. What happened next would defy all logic of war, all doctrines of hatred, and would become a story Klaus would tell for the rest of his life. For in that quiet farmhouse, thousands of miles from the battle, this American mother was about to hand her most precious possession to the enemy. How could a mother place her child into the arms of a man who, just months before, wore the uniform of a regime bent on destroying her world? This is the story of that unimaginable moment, a moment that proves the most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not a tank or a bomber, but an act of profound and disarming trust. Before Klaus ever set foot on that Minnesota farm, his world was forged in fire and ideology. He was a child of the Reich, his mind shaped by the relentless drumbeat of propaganda. From his earliest days in the Hitler Youth, he was taught that Germany was a nation of noble warriors and America a decadent, corrupt society on the verge of collapse. Newsreels in Munich showed him images of sneering American gangsters and degenerate jazz clubs, painting a picture of a nation with no moral fiber, no discipline, and no soul. His officers reinforced this vision on the frozen steppes of Russia. They told him that if captured, the Americans would not follow any rules of war. They were mercenaries, they claimed, who would torture prisoners for sport and leave them to starve. This fear was a weapon as potent as any rifle, meant to ensure that every German soldier fought to the last man, because surrender was a fate worse than death itself. For Klaus, the war was a crucible of unimaginable brutality. He had seen friends torn apart by artillery, endured winters so cold that words froze in the air, and survived on rations of stale, sawdust-filled bread. The world was a grim, merciless place, and survival depended on hardness, on suppressing every ounce of compassion. When his unit was finally overrun in France, capture was a moment of pure terror. As American GIs surrounded him, their faces grim and weapons ready, Klaus expected the end. He braced for the blow of a rifle butt, for the cold finality of a bullet, but it never came. Instead, a young American soldier, seeing the exhaustion and fear in his eyes, simply offered him a cigarette. This was the first crack in the fortress of his beliefs. The long journey to America was a surreal procession of contradictions. Instead of being packed into suffocating cattle cars, he was placed on a train with cushioned seats. Through the window, he witnessed a nation untouched by war, endless fields of corn, tidy towns with gleaming automobiles, and skies free from the smoke of burning cities. At every stop, he expected the cruelty to begin, but it never did. Arriving at the POW camp, he was given clean clothes, a warm bunk, and meals so abundant they seemed like a cruel joke. Meat, milk, white bread, luxuries he had not seen in years. This systematic decency was more unsettling than any brutality. It didn't make sense. And it was in this state of profound confusion that Klaus first heard the news. He had been assigned to a work detail on a local American farm. He was about to step out from behind the wire into the very heart of the enemy's world. The Olsen farm was a world away from the camps and battlefields Klaus knew. It was a place of quiet rhythms, governed by the rising and setting of the sun. The farmer, a stoic man of Scandinavian descent named Arthur Olsen, greeted Klaus and the other prisoners with a firm handshake and few words. His wife, Mary, watched from the porch, her eyes wary. She held her young son, David, close to her chest. In her gaze, Klaus saw the question every American in this town was asking: how do you live alongside the enemy? The first weeks were a silent negotiation of trust. Klaus and the others worked hard, their farming skills learned in the fields of Bavaria proving useful. They mended fences, hauled hay, and tended to the livestock, all under the watchful eye of a single, often bored American guard. Arthur Olson, a man who valued hard work above all else, quickly saw that these were not the monsters from the propaganda posters. They were just young men, weary and far from home. The first gesture of kindness was small. On a scorching afternoon, Mary Olson brought out a pitcher of cold lemonade. The prisoners hesitated, looking to the guard, who simply shrugged. Tentatively, they drank. The sweet, cold liquid was a shock to their systems, a simple comfort that felt like an unimaginable luxury. Soon, the routine expanded. The midday meal, once eaten in the fields, was moved to the shade of the barn. Mary would bring out sandwiches thick with meat and cheese, and sometimes a slice of apple pie. During these breaks, the barriers began to fall. The Olsons' older children, a boy and a girl, would come out from the house, their initial fear replaced by a bold curiosity. They would ask Klaus his name, pointing at objects and asking for the German word. Klaus, who had a younger sister he hadn't seen in 3 years, found himself smiling, the expression feeling foreign on his face. The true turning point came one Sunday. After the morning's chores, Arthur Olson approached Klaus. "We're having our dinner," he said slowly, gesturing toward the house. "You come, eat with us." Klaus was stunned. The camp rules strictly forbade prisoners from entering American homes. He looked at the guard, who again seemed to look the other way, understanding that on this remote farm, the rules of human decency sometimes outweighed military protocol. Walking into that farmhouse was like stepping into another dimension. The warmth of the kitchen, the smell of a roasting chicken, the sight of a family gathered around a polished wooden table, it was an assault on everything he had been taught to expect. He sat at their table, a soldier of the Third Reich, as the Olsons bowed their heads in prayer. That first Sunday dinner became a ritual. Week after week, Klaus would work on the farm, and on Sunday, he would join the Olson family at their table. The initial awkwardness slowly melted away, replaced by a quiet, comfortable familiarity. He learned the names of everyone in the family, from Arthur's elderly father down to the youngest child. He learned about their lives, their worries about the war, their hopes for the future. They, in turn, learned about his. He spoke of his home in the mountains, of his mother's garden, of the festivals in his village. He never spoke of the war, and they never asked. At that table, he was not a Nazi soldier. He was simply Klaus, a young man who missed his family. The children were the bridge. They saw no uniform, only a new and interesting person. The Olson's daughter would show Klaus her schoolwork, and he would help her with her sums. Their son would bring out his toy soldiers, and together they would invent games in the yard. It was through these innocent interactions that Klaus felt the last of his ideological armor begin to rust and fall away. He was witnessing a world built not on command and obedience, but on a foundation of simple, unshakable kindness. He would later write in a journal about the profound culture shock. He saw how Arthur and Mary spoke to each other as equals, how they encouraged their children to ask questions, how they treated their farmhands with respect. It was a democracy in miniature, a concept he had only ever heard derided. Here he saw it in practice, and it was nothing like the chaos he had been promised. It was strong, resilient, and deeply humane. One afternoon, as winter began to set in, the family was gathered in the living room. Klaus sat by the fire, watching the snow fall outside the window. Mary was in her rocking chair, trying to soothe her fussy infant son, David. The baby wouldn't settle, his small cries filling the room. Klaus watched, his heart aching with a memory of his own baby nephew, whom he had held only once before being sent to the front. Without thinking, he spoke in his halting English. "Sometimes," he said softly, "they like to be held, looking out." He gestured toward his shoulder. Mary looked at him, a long, searching gaze. She saw no enemy, only a young man with a sad, gentle expression. The house was silent, save for the crackling fire and the baby's cries. And then she made a decision that would forever define Klaus's experience of America. She stood up, walked across the room, and gently placed her infant son into the arms of the German prisoner of war. Klaus froze. His entire body went rigid. His mind raced with a torrent of conflicting emotions. Terror that he might drop the child, shock at the sheer weight of trust being placed upon him, and a wave of overwhelming grief for the world and the family he had lost. His hands, which had held rifles and thrown grenades, trembled as he took the small, warm weight of the baby. He was an enemy, a captive, a symbol of a hateful ideology. And yet, here he was, holding the future of an American family in his arms. He carefully turned the baby as he had suggested so the child could see over his shoulder. He patted the baby's back gently, his movements clumsy but tender. Almost instantly, the baby's cry softened, replaced by a contented sigh. David settled against the rough wool of Klaus's prisoner uniform and grew quiet. Klaus stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, tears silently streaming down his face. In that moment, the war was over for him. The propaganda, the hatred, the years of brutality, it all dissolved in the face of one mother's radical act of faith in his humanity. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, holding a child. And that simple, undeniable truth changed everything. When the war finally ended, Klaus was sent back to a Germany that was little more than rubble and ghosts. He found his hometown destroyed, his family gone. For years, he struggled to rebuild his life from the ashes, haunted by the horrors he had witnessed and the ideology that had betrayed him. But one memory sustained him through the darkest times, the memory of a warm kitchen in Minnesota and the weight of a baby in his arms. Years later, once mail service was restored, Klaus wrote a letter. It was a long shot, addressed simply to the Olsen family near camp in Minnesota. He didn't know if it would ever arrive. But weeks later, a reply came. It was the beginning of a correspondence that would span over 4 decades. Klaus and the Olsens exchanged letters every year, sharing news of their families, their farms, their lives. Klaus married and had children of his own. He named his firstborn son David. He told his children stories not of the war's glory, but of the kindness he had found in the heart of his enemy's country. He taught them that the strongest nations are not those who are the most ruthless, but those who are confident enough in their own values to show compassion. The story of Klaus and the Olsens was not unique. Across America, in countless small towns and rural communities, similar bonds were forged. These were not grand treaties or political maneuvers, but quiet, personal acts of grace that laid the foundation for a future peace. These American families, by simply opening their homes and their hearts, achieved what no army could. They transformed an enemy's worldview, not through force, but through the undeniable power of their humanity. The legacy of these friendships is a testament to a different kind of victory, a victory of character. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, a simple gesture of trust, as profound as a mother placing her child in a soldier's arms, can change the course of a life and echo across generations. These untold stories of compassion are a vital part of our history, proving that the heart of America was, and remains, its greatest strength.